Although Boudicca and her line may have died out, the impact she left in Britain is not one which can be unwedged so easily. The Iceni policy of revoking Saxon and Norse land for redistribution among Picts was probably the only thing stopping the Celts from being once again wiped from the Isles. While the Welsh curse had taken down Boudicca, it wouldn't be that force of nature to wipe the Picts out. That honor would go to the Saxons, who had something of an animosity for the Picts, after all the drama with Alfred and Boudicca. Alfred was a symbol to the Saxons, a symbol whose death was very much blamed on the Iceni family. With the end of that family, the anger of the Wessex clan had nowhere to go except towards the rest of the realm they once ruled. Simultaneously, many of the Pictish lords weren't looking to be snuffed out just because their leader was gone. For the time being, Britannia was ruled by Noilina's father, who was a Norse ruler. This was a great victory for the Danes, who now ruled both the Danelaw of the north and Britannia from coast to coast. This left the Picts as subjects of their enemies, while also being threatened from the outside. This brings us to the new protagonist of the story, Gede Uab Idwalon of Warwick. He was one of Boudicca's appointed lords who took control of the Midlands. He's young and is largely perceived as the new head of the Pictish people's fight against the invaders. Will Gede be able to revive the movement and bring about a redeemed Albion? Let's find out. Gede's first important action would be to remove the foreign lord of Britannia. This Norse lord, Kjartan, was a surprisingly unwarlike king given his background, and assuming he didn't get any outside support, he shouldn't be too tough to take down. The question was how to go about it without weakening the realm so much that the Saxons to the south could smell weakness. Normally, the AI of this game is not particularly opportunistic, but in this case, I've invited in fellow YouTuber Fo0 to take control of the Saxons. With a proper, player-controlled opposition, reclaiming Britain may be a real challenge. To start, Gede got himself some council rights and became the steward for the realm. He'd need a big income to take down Kjartan, and what better way than to get on his payroll? Quickly after obtaining the role as steward though, the king was going for some tyrannical moves, and this caused a rebellion from all the Pictish vassals. Gede of course joined in on this, although Kjartan had quite the army up his sleeve. Indeed, he had the Jomsvikings and his own army which he inherited from the Iceni family. It was strange that those Celtic warriors would fight against their own kind, but ultimately, whoever pays their wages is who they're loyal to, I suppose. This war was looking grim. Although Kjartan was winning every battle, Gede chose to avoid their army and sneak into a siege of the capital in East Anglia. The idea was to try and capture some of Kjartan's family and hold the capital to swing the war in the Picts' favor. Although it worked briefly, Kjartan was able to swing the war back into his favor again by decimating the Pictish armies and even took past East Anglia. This was a troubling swing, with the Picts having to perhaps give in soon. Instead of trying to win what seemed to be a losing war, Gede organized a murder plot to rid the realm of Kjartan and his tyranny. This plot was easy to pull off given Kjartan's poor reputation. One of the unfortunate consequences of this murder though was that the Kingdom of Wales was promised to the Norse King of Sweden, Eirikr, who suddenly became an important player on the British field. The outcome no one was expecting, though, was for the realm to pass over to a new Queen Boudicca, who was a cousin of Kjartan and of the Iceni family, which was previously believed to be a dead house. It seemed some stragglers were still around to claim their birthright. Unfortunately for Boudicca, though, with the loss of the Jomsvikings, the war was going to shift in the direction of the rebelling Picts. This Boudicca was already depressed over her family's death, and her position on the throne was relatively contentious. At the same time as this change in leadership, the Saxons down south got involved in the war to take Essex, which was an opportunistic decision for sure, but it also weakened the Britannic Queen, making the rebels' lives easier. Eventually, after all this war, things ended inconclusively, as the original starter of the rebellion passed away, making all its effort a waste. This meant Boudicca would stay queen a bit longer, at least until Gede saw an opportunity to replace her. In theory, a Pictish queen meant the yoke was off, but this queen was weak and seen as the last vestige of a dead house. She had to go. As part of the route to freedom, Gede began a scheme to claim the Brittany throne. Although he had no blood claim to the throne, he ruled the largest section of the kingdom and was a far more competent and ambitious ruler. He had the support of the realm and was going to take the next couple of years to plan his ascension to the throne. With the scheme taking a few years, Gede had time to spend with his family. He was able to have a daughter, which named Uluwen. Whether she'd be the next queen of Britannia or not would depend on two things: Gede's ability to take the throne, and the existence of a son. Besides that, Gede didn't do much besides plan out his scheme. He was almost caught near the end of the scheme, but ultimately was successful in claiming the throne, and from there formed a faction to put himself on the throne. The funny thing was that by simply having the claim, the recently implemented Scandinavian election laws gave Gede the opportunity to get the throne without conflict. He simply had to wait until the drunk, depressed, and old Boudicca passed away. It was funny to think about the great warrior queen, and her history of establishing this new kingdom carved out from the lands of hostile kingdoms, in comparison with this shell of a woman who carried her name. All that time ago, Boudicca propagated her name across the family so that they might glorify her even after her death, yet this Boudicca was a stain on the family name. It seemed though that this Boudicca wasn't dying fast enough, so in an attempt to accelerate the process, it was time to murder. Although it felt somewhat wrong to murder a fellow Pict in many ways, This is what would be best for the Pictish people, even if at the cost of one life. It's a morally consequentialist rationale, yet a rationale nonetheless. The murder was relatively easy, but it did have a similar unexpected consequence to the previous monarch's death. The personal land of the last Boudicca passed to her closest blood relative, which just so happened to be the same King Eirikur who inherited Wales. Slowly, the Swedes were seeming to become the winners in Britain, as Britannia fell under Gedde's control while losing access to its eastern coast. This was now quite worrying, since while England had grown, the Danelaw stagnated, and Sweden arrived on the scene, Britannia has only shrunk and waned under its chaotic rule. Gedde would have to do some drastic maneuvers to save the realm now, if he even could. Things did not look good. To start off his rulership, King Gedde needed money, and the best money he could get was from raiding. Who could he raid? Pretty much only the Danelaw. This wouldn't be an easy raiding campaign, but it was at least possible, unlike against the Swedes or Saxons. The armies met in the field of Jorvik, and although it was a close battle, the Picts came out on top. This left the rest of the Danelaw available to raid. The raiders of the Danelaw came home to a hero's welcome, as suddenly the Picts had finally won something against someone besides themselves. With the realm having lost what was once the Iceni homeland to the Swedes, the Picts of Mercia were developing a new identity. And although they were very much afraid of the Saxons in the south, the Saxons who had been subjects to these Picts for so long were starting to meld with their rulers, and out of that melting pot came a new culture, the Brythonians. Although still very much a Brythonic people, as indicated by the name, these people took on more of the attitudes of their Saxon subjects. Rather than focus solely on war, the Brythonians were a more inwardly looking people, choosing to settle down and intermingle. Over the years of connection, and with the disconnect from the new Pictish homelands of East Anglia, the Brythonians are the new people of the Midlands. Riding the high of their new identity and recent victories, the Brythonians went after the Saxons down south and decided that the rich lands of Wessex would be worthwhile plunder. The Saxons were off fighting in Francia, and on account of that, the Brythonians had free reign to raid the whole countryside. During the raid on Hampshire, Gedde's men captured the maligned, ugly, unwanted son of Peter, Bjortwin. What will they do with this poor child? That remained to be seen. But Gedde took the child as a hostage and had a special interest in his future. Maybe, through this kid, he could have some leverage on his enemies. At the same time as Gedde adopted the boy from Wessex, he had a son of his own, which his wife of Norse origins wanted to call Fridrik. But that felt a little out of place given the recent fighting with the Northmen that had been occurring, so in place of that name, Gedde chose Geralt instead. From this raid, Gedde reconsidered his options again. To the north was still the Danelaw, although funnily enough the king there, Sigfrid, had actually adopted local culture and become an Anglo-Saxon himself, despite being an Asatru king. This meant it could have been possible that the North Saxons and South Saxons could have considered colluding, and in light of that, Gedde created a devilish alliance between himself and the Swedish king. Despite the growing Swedish influence, battle lines were being drawn and enemies defined. It seemed that despite the Swedes inheriting what the Britannian realm considered its legal territory, it would end up being the only friend that they could find. Funnily enough though, almost as quickly as that alliance was forged, it fell apart, as Eirikur died, and left their Britannian territory split between Wales and Sweden. Seeing opportunity, Gedde immediately went to war to take southern Wales for himself, given that their king was a mere child. The war was simple, and Wales quickly fell without any support. The real question now was whether or not it was time to reclaim the eastern coast. In the meantime, Wiltshire was up for grabs, and the Saxons were already going for it. Both the Britannians and the English were going after it, and although it was only a tiny piece of land, what was important was asserting dominance. When Wiltshire's forces arrived to fend off the Saxons, the Britannians simply sat at their already built siege camps, awaiting to fight the winner. Although the Saxons were winning the battle, they knew that they would lose against their awaiting foes, and so they chose to retreat and give up the battle. The Wiltshire Count celebrated his miraculous victory, only to realize that he had been left for dead at the heads of the Brythonians. With that battle, and a short siege later, Britannia had won the day, claiming the rest of Hwicha and completing its legal territorial extent southwards. Nonetheless, war against Saxons seemed unwise, since the Christians had holy orders and money and options for alliances. Instead, the Britannian campaign would look north. The Danelaw was clearly an outdated concept, and it was time to move against them. With the Midland Picts heading into something of a resurgence under Gedde, the Danelaw became more than just a raiding target, but a conquest target. In particular, with the looming Swedish power being pacified through the succession, and the Saxon king Peter recently being humiliated with the Wiltshire incident, the Danelaw looked ripe for the taking. The war for Jorvik was on, but it turned out that the rascal Saxons weren't going to let the war go without trying to make some use of it, as Peter declared a war to take Hwicha. This was now a two-front war, but Gedde wouldn't be dissuaded so easily. The idea was to defeat the Danes and sweep back around to defeat the Saxons quickly but without reproach. That being said, after Jorvik fell, Peter hired some mercenaries and a holy order of fervent Catholic knights, who in combination with his professional army would likely crush the smaller army of the Brythonians. Why waste the men, Gedde thought. So Hwicha was handed over without too much fuss, giving away the Stonehenge to the Saxons, which was a bit of a morale hit for the pagans of the Midlands, but for now spirits were high with the breaking of the Danelaw. To To keep spirits up, the army went for a raiding campaign through Alba in the north, which thanks to the breakthrough in Jorvik was now much more accessible than before. Unfortunately though, Alba was stronger than it may have first appeared, as they were able to fend off Gede's raiders. Another morale hit. These morale hits were starting to add up. Although the tides would turn when Peter's realm was busy with a war across the channel, this meant a free raid against the Saxons was up for grabs, and Gede needed both the money and the win for his realm. During the raid, Gede managed to run off with yet another Saxon child, this one named Lefweld. He was a 17-year-old boy, which meant he was more useful than just a little pet project. Instead, Lefweld could be an interesting political maneuver. Gede recruited him and forced him into a marriage with one of his own daughters. If, in theory, a marriage could be made, the Saxons might consider a peaceful option over conquest. The chances of that working were near zero, but it was worth trying. Some might say that an alliance forged over a kidnapped and forced married couple would be a bit legally scrupulous, but others would call that a genius diplomatic maneuver. To each their own interpretation, I say. In the meantime, the Danelaw was well and truly falling apart, as Gwynedd claimed their independence. The return of the Welsh, who none dared to harass or upset. At least that was the commonly understood boundary. Gede, perhaps not heeding the wisdom of families past, decided to raid the newly released Welsh lords. That choice had some, shall we say, spine-chilling effects around the court, as the old Welsh curse was not something to be messed with. If it could take down Boudicca, what would make Gede safe? For now, that wouldn't be what mattered, as the Danelaw truce was over, and there was land to be conquered. By this point, the Danelaw is a shadow of its former self, as the lands up to Alba fall without any problem. The Saxons do not intervene. With that, the Danelaw is basically no more, but nonetheless, Gede wanted to take the rest of whatever land he could to build up for the war against England. So he attacked Gwynedd for their land in the de jure territory of the Danelaw. Would he live to regret dragging the Welsh into this conflict? Maybe. Probably. The Welsh would prove to be frustrating, but not difficult opponents. They couldn't possibly win in battles, but the lack of siege equipment among the Brythonic soldiers made taking their fortresses in the forests and hills feel almost impossible. The war against Gwynedd seemed to last forever, and Gede really felt age creeping up on him in those years-long sieges in some backwater outskirt of the Danelaw. At least, of all things, the prolonged Welsh war passed enough time for the truce to end, as in 962, Gede declared the final war to end the Danelaw, this time with siege equipment in tow. The war was simple at this point, as the Danelaw was effectively a rump state ruled by a child. Now there was no more Danelaw, and this meant that it didn't really formally exist. At the end of the day, the Danelaw was a great compromise between the Northmen and the Saxons. If the Danes were gone, what Danelaw was there to be had? In essence, the futility of the Danelaw was actually what ended the Bretonnian-English peace. Although Gede did a lot to put Britannia back on the map, he was only one king, and it was looking more and more true that the Saxons were outpacing him. One issue he had failed to address was the rising cost of the army, which he used to claim so much worldly prestige. Without money, how could he defeat the Saxons? The answer was he couldn't. There was one last opportunity for amicability with the Saxons, and that was to fight the Swedes together. A hidden deal was made between the new Saxon king, Alfred II, and Gede to split what remained of Sweden's land in England, with England getting the rest of East Anglia and Britannia getting the remains of Jorvik. This deal was certainly lopsided, but it would do for now while Gede scrambled to figure out a game plan. The hope was to establish a relatively peaceful intention with Alfred II, and maybe coexist for the near future and take back Britannian homelands later down the line. Throughout the hemming and hawing of Saxon relations, it turned out Gede had made the mistake that so many other lords before him had done. He ignored the Welsh. Indeed, Gwynedd came back to haunt him as seemingly from nowhere, the Welsh lords attacked to take back their land off in what was once Danelaw. They had eyed themselves one of the Norse vassals of Alba and brought their armies in long ships to win the war for them. As humiliating as it was, Gede had to surrender and give up recently won land. Panic started to set in, as Gede was now quite old and he realized that his realm was looking like it would be the one to die at the hands of the Saxons. He went for a raid into Saxon territory to try and scramble together some funds, but in his great panic, many were questioning his decisions. Wasn't he looking for peaceful relations with the Saxons? Why raid? Before he knew it, Gede had overworked himself, and he passed away of old age, leaving his kingdom in the hands of his grandson, Anil, who was only 8 years old. It turned out that Gede, so lost in his campaigns and diplomacy, hadn't even noticed that his one and only son, Geralt, had died. But at least there was a grandson to take the throne. Could a child king reasonably hold together the realm against a powerful Saxon realm? The sweat in the room at his coronation was enough to raise the humidity of all England, and they say to this day, their poor weather can be attributed to this great humidification of the land. The first thing to happen under Anil's rule was a crushing defeat to the Saxons during his grandfather's raid, which certainly did not set the mood all too well. Anil was smart enough to know that he would need to make some great moves to show himself as a competent king, and that meant earning a martial reputation in his mind. He personally attended raids against Alba in his early teens and tried to be the most fair and understanding king he could be. Although he was training in the art of war, he wanted to be a true statesman and strive to understand the laws of the land, and how to listen to others so he could gain experience. Anil was becoming a strangely shrewd diplomat, let alone warrior. He would have his revenge against England when they were off in a war in Europe, while his armies were able to raid to get rich off of Saxon farms. That money would prove invaluable, as Anil began to consider his options to deal with the Saxons. It simply was the truth that he could not expect to defeat them in war, barring some kind of crazy rebalancing of the scales. He set about righting the wrong that was the Welsh conquest from before, and then considered alliances. Although they were far off, the Baltic people were reportedly strong in their region, so Anil arranged to patrol them with himself and a Prussian princess. Maybe their armies could be the tip of the balance he needed, yet when considering the calculus of the region, the power of the Christian holy orders, and the mercenaries Alfred II had at his disposal, they greatly outweighed some Tribec Baltic people. At the end of the day, Anil turned 16 in 977, and from then on was a man. He grew in his youth to be fair and even-headed, although he did develop some vices into his adulthood, being close to the ladies and a bit hot-headed at times. Nonetheless, he was an impressive commander for his age. In one last attempt to save his people, Anil arranged a meeting with Alfred II to discuss terms of war, but there was no reason to not run things in an orderly manner. What they'd do was something of a gentleman's agreement. They'd go to war with Alfred the aggressor to take Mercia. If the Saxons win, then Anil will renounce his kingdom of Britannia, convert to Christianity, and swear fealty to the Saxons. With this, he could at least guarantee the lives of his people and perhaps settle up in Jorvik, loyal to the Saxons, but still alive. If Anil were to win the war, then the inverse would happen, with Alfred becoming a pagan and swearing fealty to Anil. Either outcome felt like it would preserve the Brythonian people, at least for now, although of course Anil wanted to win. Initially, the numbers looked extremely one-sided, as Alfred had even allied with Ireland and used them to bolster his ranks. The Holy Orders, mercenaries, and Irish alongside the Saxon army were overwhelming, and although the Balts were a great reinforcement, they were enough to make it possible to win the first battle outside Warwick. The capital quickly fell, followed by the outskirts, and lost battle after lost battle devastated Anil, whose spirit was pretty broken after being so handedly defeated. He didn't give up at first, but after a failed attempt to capture Winchester under Alfred's nose, the jig was up. Anil surrendered, and Mercia was handed over to Alfred. Beholding no land in Britannia, the title was destroyed, and Anil became merely the Duke of Mercia as he sat in the old Danelaw throne room. At least it was a throne room, in a way, although that of a realm that had come and gone. The time came to hold up his bargain, and he did. Anil became Catholic and swore fealty, which more or less marked the end of any Pictish or Brythonic ambition to rise up. How the Brythonic people would be treated was in the hands of the Saxons now, as finally England was united under a Saxon banner. Alfred II, the great unifier of England, Bretwalda, was the master of England, and everyone knew it. Would history remember Anil well? Maybe they see his fight as valiant, and he'd go down as honorable for agreeing to this bargain. But there was no telling how disappointed Boudicca and her family must have felt to know that their fight was in vain in the end. With England united, that marks the true ending for Britannia and the Iceni family. They died out long before the fate of their people was determined, but nonetheless, the foundation they laid was not strong enough to resist the forces of history. I hope you enjoyed this story about the Celtic people of Britain and their futile fight. I wanted to give a huge thanks to Foe0 for working with me on this series. He kinda just reached out on a whim, and I proposed the idea. He was all for it and did a great job playing along and working to create the best story he could alongside the foundation I had already laid. Although collaborations are often difficult, working with Foe was easy, and I'd certainly do it again, given the opportunity. If you enjoyed the video, consider checking out his perspective, which will give you a narration of the Saxon View events over on his channel, and dropping him a like and subscription. See you for the next story. Thank you for your time.